There's certainly an element to that, especially as you get higher in your career, but it's an execution-oriented job, and that's what a lot of folks don't quite understand, and that's what I was spending time educating them on. For me, even as a fairly senior product manager at Lyft and some of these other companies I've worked at, I would say probably only 10% of my time was spent on strategy. You got to get stuff done.
All right, Rohan, so happy to have you here to talk about your experience with your MBA in Harvard Business School. Could you kick things off for us by giving us a little bit of background on who you are and where you're coming from before we dive into all things MBA and business school?
Thanks for having me, Mike. Hey guys, my name is Rohan Nagesh, born and raised in the Bay Area. Went to Berkeley for my undergrad, studied computer science. I always knew I wanted to do something in technology. It's kind of hard not to growing up in the Bay Area. Enjoyed my time at Berkeley, got to dive into a lot of interesting technical topics, and also got to experience what it was like to work in the real world through a few internships. And that led me to product management. It was a very nice blend of business, technology, leadership, design, all the things that I was studying and reading about. And it kind of just stuck with me. I did that for a few years, went off to HBS. I can talk a little bit more later about the motivations for doing that. Graduated in 2017. Spent some more time in product after HBS, a couple of years at Google, a couple of years at Lyft, and then decided to start my own company, Hirefly. And it's been a great ride. It's been 3+ years now.
Amazing. Thanks for that quick overview. That's really helpful. I think that will guide this conversation a bit. But I do want to, if it's okay with you, take it back a little bit. You talked about, I think you studied computer science at Berkeley, right?
Yep.
And then you pursued a career in product management. And then I guess a couple years in, tell me about like how you even started thinking about an MBA. Was this something, it sounds like tech was always kind of like in your DNA growing up in the Bay Area, but what about the MBA? Is that something that you learned about early in your life or came along the way after working a couple years after college?
Yeah, so I was fortunate to have really two amazing managers during my time at Groupon, which was my first job out of school. And they both had MBAs. Interestingly, even my engineering manager had an MBA. And Groupon was such a cool place to be in that, it was the fastest growing company at the time to $1 billion. We had exploding user base, financial growth, everything. And then everything came tumbling down after the company went public. And it just got me thinking, and my manager as well, around, hey, what are the non-technical reasons behind why a business is successful or not successful? Because by all accounts, Groupon had an amazing, technology team, product was great and all of that, but it still didn't do well. It didn't live up to expectations. And that's actually what got me thinking about business school, because coming from an engineering mindset, you're so used to engineering is the be-all, end-all. That's all you need for a company to be successful. And then at Groupon, I think I learned, hey, investor relations is really important. How you tell your story, right? When you start going public, hiring the right people, operations and management, not throwing people at problems, not over-hiring, marketing, how you communicate to customers and retain them. All of these things are things that I just didn't have a lot of knowledge about, and Groupon proved to me that they were equally important. And so I wanted to go out to business school and just broaden my horizons a little bit. I think also just completely aside from the professional side of it, for me, this is specific to me, business school was an opportunity to broaden who I interact with on a day-to-day basis. Having grown up in the Bay Area, having gone to Berkeley, studied computer science there, largely my friend group was homogenous. The folks that I worked with were homogenous, and I think it was just time for a change.
Oh, that's great. I appreciate that. Yeah, usually the answers to that question are pretty career focused, but there's a personal component there for you too, in terms of like your personal development, your experiences. That's really good. I'm gonna come back to that. But you described, your rationale for going to business school and how the idea came to you from some great managers. And that makes total sense to me. It's like you started thinking more and more intellectually about the business side of business, or like the non-technical side of businesses. So you want to explore that further. There's a curiosity there. So how did that rationale translate to your essays and applications? So going to your application process. Yeah, I'm curious. So how many, did you apply to a few different schools? Obviously you applied to HBS, but I'm curious how that translated. And if you remember what you wrote in your essays, or shared about your long-term and short-term goals?
Yeah, in terms of the application process, I kept it pretty tight. I knew that, for me, it wasn't, if I wanted to be in product management long term, which I did want to be, I didn't really have any gripes with what I was doing professionally. Um, it wasn't really the case for me that I needed an MBA, right? And so I wanted to make sure that if I was doing it, I was doing it with the best in terms of the students, in terms of the teachers, the brand, et cetera. So I kept it pretty tight. I applied to Harvard, Stanford, and Wharton. And in terms of my essays, I spent a lot of time just thinking actually about what I want to do. And I tell this to people all the time when they ask me how to approach the application. I probably spent 80% of my time just noodling on why the heck am I even considering this? What do I want to do long term? What are my strengths and weaknesses? I also talk to my managers about this, where they think I could grow. And if you don't really have a case in terms of that framing, then it may not make sense for you to pursue an MBA. So that was kind of how I approached it. And the essay just flowed from there. After I did my introspection, it was pretty clear what the story was, right? I had aspirations to broaden my knowledge of being in technology. I wanted to learn about the non-technical aspects of making a business successful. At the time, I maybe thought I wanted to start a company, but it wasn't super crystallized or anything like that. And so I did write in my essay that I thought potentially HBS could be a place for me to experiment with entrepreneurship, bounce ideas off of my peers, meet professors, attend talks. It's just like a nice intellectual breeding ground for ideas. And I also talked about the personal side of it as well, that I wanted to broaden, like I was saying, my friend group and learn about different cultures. All that came together pretty quickly.
That's great. That's great. And I don't know about you, but that process for me was you described like an introspection. You looked outwards to kind of your colleagues for feedback on who you were. And then you also kind of looked inwards probably during that process, think about your strengths and weaknesses. For me, that was like really hard. At that point in life where I was, I had never really done any kind of work like that on myself. What was that like for you? It sounded like you went about it in a very like methodical way. You sought feedback from your managers, like honest feedback, I guess, right? Any tips for people who are going through that, thinking about going through that process right now? And it sounds like you dug pretty deep, and I think that's helpful for probably most applications. So any advice on how you did that, or kind of tools or approaches to that process?
I have a doc actually with a checklist of questions, which I'm happy to share with you afterwards.
I would love that. Yeah.
It's the usual stuff that you might get asked probably in the HBS interview itself, right? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? What are your strengths and weaknesses? For me, talking to my managers was really helpful because both of them had MBAs. So they could contextualize everything that I wanted to do, in context of what I would get from the MBA. And they were both very clear with me that it was a non-essential degree for where I was, given I enjoyed being a product manager. I was already at great companies. So we were approaching it from the perspective of rounding out my skill set and giving me that kind of broader exposure. So it came together. For me, the introspection part certainly was the harder part. Like I said, I probably spent 80% of my time introspecting, talking to people and getting the story right with these questions. So I followed that process pretty methodically, talked to obviously folks who had applied to Harvard in particular, because that's where I wanted to go. My managers went to Booth and Stanford, so I got some learnings there, but each school is different. So you definitely want to talk to some alumni. And then the actual essay writing part itself, I think I banged it out in a couple of weekends because everything was in my head, right? But getting to that point where everything was in my head took a lot of introspection.
Yeah, so the writing was a short part, right? The figuring it out was the harder work that took a little bit more time. And I love that you said like you spoke to people who went to HBS. You had people that you worked with, managers that had MBAs, so you had that perspective. I love that because that's the intent of this project. This post MBA project is we're not going to be able to replicate if you were to talk to someone yourself one-on-one. But hopefully this helps scratch a little bit of the surface for people who might be curious about MBAs in HBS, and they can use this conversation and the couple other ones that we have up as a resource. So I love that you said that. Yeah, cool. So, you get into HBS. It's a, big win for you, I'm sure. What do you remember about your experience at HBS? Do you have like a particular memory that really stands out to you about your couple years in Boston?
Oh, just how awesome it was to have 100 of your best friends, within a 30-second, radius of you that you could just hang out with. And I think the other interesting thing was because it's a full-time program, people had the intention. They were very intentional about making space, making time to get to know other people, right? And you don't really have the ability to do that when you're on the 9-to-5 grind. So for me, I just went all in on that. To be frank, I prioritized the non-academic side of HBS. Not to say that I didn't read the cases and stuff. Of course, you do all that, but for me, it's not like I was gunning for Baker Scholar or anything like that. I wanted to get the outside of classroom facets of the MBA ironed out. And that was, making great friendships. That was traveling. It's very rare that you have 2 years to just focus on yourself and really not have any pressures, right? So that's what I remember most. Easily the best 2 years of my life.
That brings back so many good memories. Yeah, the personal side and I probably skewed on if I look back, one thing I regret is probably spending too much time on the academic side of things. Although it probably helps out in some way now that I'm not aware of. But it all comes down to the relationships, at least for me too. So just the experience of having 100 of your best friends like in the same room every single day. And this sounds like so elementary, but like I love that we could play like intramural sports. Like
sure.
It's so easy to like round up 10 people for a pickup basketball game, whereas like nowadays it's like nearly impossible. So that's cool. I can see it in your eyes, like you thinking back fondly to that experience.
Yeah, I was huge on IM basketball as well. And the travel was also super unique to business school, unique to full-time business schools, especially. We would go out as soon as we would hear about a 3 or 4 day weekend, like we were going somewhere, right?
Yeah.
And that was awesome to be able to travel, experience new cultures. I think I hit something like 12 countries during my time at HBS.
Wow. Okay. That's a lot, I think. That's a lot. That's great. I want to ask you about being like a experienced product manager in business school. I don't think at least for my section, so if I use my section and extrapolate it in terms of like the class, there aren't that many folks coming in that want to be that have product manager experience, I think. But I think there's a lot of people who want to go into product management post business school. Was that the same for you in your class? We're pretty close in terms of like the years.
Yeah. I would say so. I think Amazon was actually the most common employer post graduation.
Post graduation, yeah, that makes sense. And did so how did that play into your experience? Like, did you feel like you had like a different lens through which you were kind of reading these cases or going through the courses, or even just extracurriculars too? Did some of your classmates use you as a resource for like prepping for interviews, maybe on how to think about product manager careers? Curious to know through your PM lens what your experience was like at HBS.
Yeah, I think it showed in a couple of ways. Probably one, obvious thing was just when the case is skewed towards technology companies or, I'm thinking like entrepreneurial finance, even though it was more of a business oriented, course, a lot of the cases were about technology companies. So I could probably add some anecdote that would be valuable for some portion of the class, right? That's the first. And then I think in terms of off the school stuff, there were certainly a lot of people that wanted to get into product management. To be honest, I don't think a lot of people understood what product management actually entailed. So I think my first value add was just getting to know if this is actually something that they really wanted to do and giving them a day in the life of how my job was, and just vetting if they were interested in that. But assuming they were interested in that, there were definitely a lot of conversations around what the interview process is like, how you can best prepare, honestly, how to get your foot in the door, because it's one of the hardest careers to break into. So I was more than happy to just be a resource for my section and other people who wanted to go down that path.
Yeah. I have to double click into something you just said. So some people don't even really understand product management in the first place, but they might think they want to get into it. What were like the bigger misconceptions or like kind of misses in terms of like what product management was to a MBA student without product management in their background?
Yeah. Well, I think most people think that it's a ideation heavy job, right? You're kind of strategizing the future of your products, the future of the company. And there's certainly an element to that, especially as you get higher in your career. But it's an execution oriented job. And that's what a lot of folks don't quite understand. And that's what I was spending time educating them on. You know, for me, even as a fairly senior product manager at Lyft and some of these other companies I've worked at, I would say probably only 10% of my time was spent on strategy. You got to get stuff done. And that might be, road mapping with another team, earning their buy-in to get resource alignment. That might be going really deep into the analytics and figuring out the next thing you should build. There's a lot of work behind the scenes to make a product successful. And I think a lot of folks want to get into tech from a consulting background or from a business-oriented background. And for those types of career paths, your output is largely that strategy piece. You do the legwork, you come up with some kind of plan, and then you hand off the plan to somebody who executes. But you are the person who executes when you're the product manager, and that's the disconnect that a lot of folks have.
That's so clarifying for me. Like I just know like the job product manager is out there and it's common for business school students to want to do it. And I've even spoken to PM a little bit. I even call it PM. But yeah, the way you just described it just has clarified so many things about that. It's an execution role. I totally get the strategy stuff as a consultant, as a business background person. That totally makes sense. I know what my deliverables are, but yeah, it's all about execution too, in addition to that strategy. Very cool. And so that being said, in my head, so actually, yeah, I'll just use my assumptions around PM and gut check them with you. So when I think about PM, a big question for me is an MBA a good step for someone who wants to pursue a career in product management? And so, at least in my head, there's kind of three spots you can try to come from to get a PM job post business school. It's like you have PM experience. That's probably the best position to be in terms of likelihood of getting a job in PM post business school. Then maybe in my head, it's you're a software engineer, so you have the technical chops, and you go to business school to get the business chops to combine them, and then turn that into a PM career. And then lastly, it's just you're a business person. You come from a consulting background, maybe worked at a startup of some sort in some sort of biz ops role or product adjacent role, but you want to break into PM. That's probably the third, probably the hardest spot to break into PM. Is that order correct? Is that how you think about it too, or is there a different framework that you might think about in terms of business school and PM jobs?
I think that's about right.
Yeah, and so for those who are I'll just say, like, for those who are coming from the same background as me, like banking or consulting, and they want to break into PM, do you think business school is a good path for them? Is that going to help them get a PM role? And I guess my second question would be, we can address this later, but if you are in that position, how do you go about business school to position yourself for those interviews?
I think it definitely is helpful, even if you don't immediately land a product management role. I think for me, the holistic nature of the business school degree, whether you go to Harvard or someplace else, you're learning how to be a general manager. You're learning how to combine all of these functions together. And that's very much what I think a good product manager would do too. You don't want to just have purview over engineering and design. You want to also think about what makes your product successful. So at first pass, I think it definitely makes a lot of sense if that's what you want to do and you want to switch into product management. There are also companies from a recruitment standpoint that specifically target MBAs, right? Amazon is a very common employer, as an example. In terms of the three personas you laid out, the person who's already a product manager obviously doesn't need business school to keep climbing up the ladder, depending on what types of companies you aspire to be at. If you want to be, the VP of product at a place like Google, where I used to work, I think the MBA would actually be quite impactful. There is a lot of people management and sort of corralling that you need to do. And I think Sundar is a great example of, he went to Wharton, somebody who's, had a lot of success rising up the ladder in a way that more technical product managers perhaps didn't, who started around the same time as him. But if you want to, be at smaller organizations, yeah, I don't think necessarily that skill set translates. I think a lot of what you'll study in business school from a case study perspective is going to skew to larger organizations, right? So they're painting a picture of what a well-run organization looks like. And that's just not how it is at smaller organizations. You would always bias for somebody who's faster and has had that hands-on experience. So it really depends on what you want to do. But if you're the other two personas, you're an engineer trying to switch, or you're a non-technical person trying to switch, yeah, I think the business school experience is fantastic for you.
Awesome. Thanks for that perspective. And for you now, post business school, you've got your MBA, you got your 12 countries. How has that helped you as a product manager in your kind of post MBA career? Before starting Hirefly, just your post MBA product manager career.
I think the biggest thing for me was structured thinking. It sounds a little nebulous, but you get this coming from BCG. But a lot of engineers, designers, folks who work in technology, their instinct is to dive straight into the solution, because that's what they've been doing their whole life. They're builders. But if you can actually hold off for a little bit, see the kind of bird's eye picture for what you're trying to do, and then put a structure around the problem, that is what really, really good product managers do. And I think that's the biggest learning I got from HBS. It's not using a canned framework like the 4 Ps or something like that. It's devising your own framework to solve a problem. Okay, you have a retention problem. What does that mean in the context of your business? Are you seeing it with certain types of users? How long have you been seeing it for? You just naturally start thinking about how to diagnose the problem before you jump into a solution. I think that's the biggest thing I've gotten from HBS. I'd say probably the second is just the soft skills aspect of it for me, coming from more of an engineering-oriented background where, you don't spend as much time honing those skills. I feel a lot more comfortable, a lot more confident, in speaking situations, in political situations, and that certainly helps you climb the ladder at large companies like Google and Lyft.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. Thinking about the different considerations you just shared, I'm picturing the engineer, the expert, the subject matter expert, diving right in. I think there's like the combination, and I think of that as that's intuition. They've seen that problem before, or they've seen something like that. They kind of know where to go. Like they just go right at it. But when you combine that with structured thinking, as you say, it's very powerful. And yeah, I've always thought structured thinking was really nebulous. There's a couple things that have helped me with this. It's one, definitely business school. It was observing how people who are very structured in their thinking thought. So that was like a cool part of the classroom experience, is like, oh man, like this guy that sits over here, he always answers a question in a certain way. And you can follow along very well, very easily. And then I tried to emulate that person a little bit, in the next class. But then, so there's the classroom experience. There's a book called The McKinsey Way, which breaks this down really well. I don't know if you've heard of that one, or have you seen that?
I've heard of it.
Yeah. So pretty epic, like consulting Bible. I think that's how I think about it. But it breaks down, how they think about structured thinking, and then putting into practice at BCG. There, you couldn't afford not to be structuring your thinking. So it really impressed it upon me, and that's kind of how I pieced it together. Those are the 3 legs of the stool for me. So I'm glad you brought that up. It's kind of like reminding me of that topic. So you worked for a handful of years in product, taking on bigger and bigger roles, but then eventually you start Hirefly. And I'll kind of just open-ended question, because we're just getting to know each other a little bit. But yeah, but you did mention you had an inkling of maybe starting a company one day. But tell me about that, your experience transitioning from your PM career, which is pretty stellar, right, to starting your own business. What motivated you to do that?
Yeah, like you said, I think I had an inkling going into HBS, and HBS helped a lot actually, with the first, point of interaction being my fellow classmates who were interested in this stuff. I would be talking to my friends, bouncing ideas off of them. Second is the Rock Center. I actually didn't do an internship, and the Rock Center was nice enough to give me some stipend for the summer to go work on my own idea. And I had very little understanding of what it took to actually pull off a business. So that summer was really enlightening. I had an idea from my time at Groupon. I wanted to build a mobile concierge app, and it'd help you go about and do something in your city with your friends, your spouse, whoever it is. And that summer, I just spent, actually going soup to nuts, doing the designs and the idea, but also, the business side of it, validating it, acquiring users, writing the code myself. And ultimately, the idea didn't really pan out, but that experience got me hooked with entrepreneurship, and I knew I wanted to have another crack at it. And I also learned separately that for me personally, a consumer startup is probably not the best fit for my skill sets. Consumer is it's so hard. You have to really intuitively grasp what makes people tick and what makes them engage with a mobile app. Whereas I think with a B2B oriented product, it's a lot more of a rational pitch, right? I'm saving you time. I'm saving you money. I'm helping you make more money. And that to me was a lot more analytically oriented. And that's kind of how I used to think as well as I was forming my ideas. So that was a really good learning. I don't, hold any grudges at all for that first experience. And I took that and wanted to build on it, and I knew that I wanted to do a B2B startup. So I actually went to Google Cloud after HBS to get that B2B experience, because I'd never worked in a B2B setting before. And it was at Google that I got the idea for Hirefly. Obviously, Google, fantastic company, lots of great technical problems, but also a lot of interesting business challenges that you're exposed to, especially with Google Cloud, because it's an enterprise organization. I was talking to, some of the big shots at huge companies, Colgate, so many other companies, Whirlpool, and these are companies I had never really interacted with. They're not your traditional technology companies. So seeing these types of companies in person and understanding where technology can impact and transform their business, it cued me into search as a really seminal building block for all types of organizations. And so my team at Google was working on enterprise search, and they were approaching it from a very myopic perspective, in my opinion, where the product that we were selling was really just geared towards an internal audience within the company. So we'd make a search engine of sorts that would sit on top of your company's data and allow your internal users to search. So it could be an engineering parts database. It could be your HR portal to see when your vacation days are. Whatever it is, we would build a unified search. So it's like you have Google inside your company. But there were so many applications outside your company that relate to search, or between companies to improve communication. And I felt those were actually higher value applications. So I started noodling on it. And you know how it is with big companies, it's really hard to actually bring an entirely new direction through. So I was just working on this on my own and had no intention of launching it within Google, but got exposed to the problem space, got a pretty good understanding of the technology building blocks, the search infrastructure, the machine learning infrastructure. And as I was talking to folks, people search became top of mind. It was really, really important for a sales rep to be able to identify the right prospect to go after. It was important for recruiters to be able to identify the right candidates to go after. Marketers, same thing. And so I looked at all of these problem spaces and I thought, well, recruiting seems like a space where, the behemoth is LinkedIn. And I felt in a lot of ways, LinkedIn had not innovated in the last 5 to 10 years. Whereas you look at the sales space, or you look at, demand gen and marketing, hundreds of startups, and also not such a huge concentrated leader like LinkedIn is in the recruiting space, which I actually thought was a good thing. Some people are scared away from that, but I thought if there's really only one person to beat, and I feel good about beating that person, that seems like a credible argument to start a company in that space. So that was really everything that came together as to why I started Hirefly in particular. And it was a lot of, like I said, introspecting and doing user interviews and really vetting that this was actually a problem, I wasn't writing any code.
Yeah. So you identified greater potential in a technology that you were, that you had experience and exposure to. You had your hands on at Google. And so you're like, there must be other applications for this. That's pretty limited in the way we're using it today. We're selling it today at Google. And you caught the fire. You caught the itch to go test and see if it could work specifically with the recruiting market. So that's incredible. So yeah, it's been 4 years. How has your MBA come into the picture and or manifested as you're, starting a business from scratch and trying to innovate and create something new, a new product, new technology for a kind of a legacy industry?
I think the first thing was just being able to think through the business plan pretty holistically. So again, in a previous life, I might have just jumped right into coding up something, right? But being able to take a step back and actually assess, is there something here? How big can this be? How big of a problem is it? And I'm not talking about, a TAM analysis or something like that, because you can just drop a chart and you can make any business look like $100 billion business. But yeah, exactly. I'm talking more about a bottoms up approach. Here's one company that I'm analyzing. If I were to do this for them, this is how it would transform their business, and this is the value that they would receive. And interviews, right? Lots of user interviews. So that structured process of generating a business plan, not just a product, but a business, I think that was the first place that HBS helped me. The second was with the connections. Once we got a little bit of insight into what we should be building and we had a basic, version of our product out, we had to get customers, right? And it's hand-to-hand combat at the beginning stages. It's not like you have people coming to your website and you just take whatever you can get your hands on. And so for most founders, it's a lot of just leaning into their networks. For me, I was fortunate to have a fantastic HBS network, not only from my section, my graduating year, but alumni as well. I would just reach out to folks if I thought that their company would be a good fit for what we're building. And 9 times out of 10, they would respond back to my email, to give me some time to meet, even if it wasn't related to sales, just giving me feedback on the idea. That was super, super useful, got our thinking refined, and ultimately many of these people became our first customers. I would say for the first 6-9 months or so of operations, we were exclusively selling into my first degree network.
Yep. And I think that's pretty common, right? Yeah, you sell your personal, network first, and then you expand it, 1 degree of separation outside of that, and you continue to grow. Now, that's a very, practical, I guess, application of an MBA. It's like you have a great network, and I think if your experience is anything like mine, you see as like the years go on, your section mates, your classmates, they, we all start off kind of in like middle manager level roles, but then as the years go on, everyone's kind of a decision maker at some point, becomes a decision maker, rises up the ranks. So it helps with those things. But yeah, the feedback and just the, the openness to just giving you time, picking up the phone, that's invaluable. And I think that's another great, showcase of what a network actually is. A lot of people say network, but it comes down to things like that. That's fantastic. So yeah, hirefly.ai. Watch out. Here we come. Very cool. I like 2 kind of wrap up questions here on for you. And I've been asking everyone this, and I'm trying to collect the notes here. But I'm curious if you've ever thought about the ROI on your MBA and how you might go about figuring that out. This is not an interview question. This is like a business consulting case study question.
Well, here's the thing. When I was applying, because I had 2 managers, like I was saying, who both went to business school, they both told me that if I wanted to stay in product management, this probably was not a financially ROI positive decision. And mentally, I had already programmed myself going in that should be something I just expect, right? And so anything I get in terms of financial ROI is gravy. But you got to think about the non-financial ROI, which in my mind was massive. All of those things we talked about with, me needing to broaden my horizons and, just get exposure to the non-technical side of things. And also just having 2 years to yourself to explore who you want to be as a man, as a friend. That was hugely impactful. I went into HBS fairly young. I started, I think, at 25.
Okay.
So a lot of maturity still yet to be done, and that happened at HBS. So no, I thought a lot about the non-financial ROI and had mentally programmed myself that I actually would not see much in terms of the financial ROI. But now that I've had 7 or 8 years on the back end to reflect, it's very clear that there's been financial ROI too, right?
Interesting.
I think even if I had stayed purely in product management, I think the rate at which somebody like us would climb up the corporate ladder, I do expect that to be faster than if you didn't have that holistic thinking. But for me, having started a company, yes, you could start a startup outside of going to business school, but it was such an accelerant with, like I said, the first year or so of sales coming from our network, our investors. It was super easy for me to fundraise. That's the other thing I didn't talk to you about. We closed our term sheet, for $6.5 million in 3 weeks.
Wow.
So it was a really quick process. Our board, the person who joined our board is also an HBS alum, right? And it was somebody who I met actually at HBS when I was first year there. So all of that was just really, really ROI positive. And I think it's just, TBD, of course, what happens with this business. But I feel, at least for me, the non-financial ROI was there in spades, and now the financial ROI has caught up as well.
Very cool.
I will say though, it's not the case for everyone. Like I was saying at the beginning, with job switchers versus people who stay in their career, there is an argument to be made that if you return to exactly what you're doing before, that it's harder to see that ROI. I think if you're a switcher, it's super, super clear. In my case, if I just returned to product management and I worked at the same types of companies that I worked at before HBS, maybe there's an argument that it would not have mattered as much. I do think in my case, the promotion velocity argument held up. But for some people, depending on the organization they might be in, perhaps it's a lot more structured, right? Like at BCG, you can't break the norms.
Yeah.
You got to stay in your level room. 2 years.
It's
right.
very structured. Yeah. You're in your time bands. Mm-hmm.
Right.
That's a very clear answer. I appreciate that. I think your consideration of like the time and the window at which you're looking at it brings another element that I haven't really thought through. Because you're like 6 or 7 years post MBA now, I believe, and
7. Yeah.
7. Yeah. And so maybe even at the 5, it was less clear, but now, that financial is becoming more and more evident. And then who knows in 10, 12, 15, right? So I think that's an important way to think about it as well. I think a lot of, and it makes sense when you're applying to business school, you think about these things, right? Or you should think about them. But it's hard to forecast anything. Definitely hard to forecast, I think, this ROI thinking. So appreciate you sharing how you're thinking about it and your experience thus far. All right, final question is just an open-ended one, Ron. It's what advice, do you want to leave with anyone? Maybe it's the version of you 9 years ago, 8 years ago when you were applying. Maybe it's just anyone who's, early in their career. Maybe it's, folks working in tech that are thinking about an MBA, if it makes sense for them. What parting advice do you have for them?
I think this last question you asked me is the most salient one to talk about. I think a lot of folks just jump into stuff because it's the logical thing to do or because it's the prestigious thing to do. And as hard as it sounds, you really do have to block out all of that noise and really hone in on what you want. Not what your parents want, not what your friends want. What do you want really? And try to spend some time on forming that story. And if it does align, yeah, fantastic. I think business school is a great opportunity for people who, like I said, are switching careers or they have some kind of an aspiration that involves getting this holistic understanding. But for many others, maybe that doesn't make sense. So that's the biggest, I think, takeaway that I have from being an entrepreneur, you probably feel this too. We are just so incredibly different from the norm. You kind of have to be in order to be an entrepreneur. You have to have this belief that what you're doing is fundamentally different, and how the world operates today is fundamentally broken. And that mindset, I think, should also translate to how you think about your personal life, in that I focus exclusively on what I want and block out the noise and external perception.
Appreciate that. Yeah, it's you can't hear that advice enough, I think. Makes sense. Very hard to put into practice, I'd say, just given where we are in the world today. But Rohan, thank you so much for this time and for this conversation. I just enjoyed learning more about your background experiences, especially centered around the MBA. I think the insights that you shared today are going to be super helpful to folks earlier in their career exploring MBAs, and just trying to figure out if product management is a good job for them, a good career path. So thanks so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.